Our guest today is Peter Vronsky, who's a Canadian author. He got a PhD in criminal justice history, and he's written about serial killers. So, 2004 Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters, Female Serial Killers, and Sons of Cain. And the newest book is called American Serial Killers, The Epidemic Years, 1950 to 2000. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Buzz.
Very good to talk to you today. So I guess the first thing to establish, and maybe people know this, maybe people don't, is that serial killings, while not completely a thing of the past, have really decreased dramatically over the past 2 decades.
Yes, indeed. Along with just your ordinary homicide as well, we have this dramatic drop in overall. Until recently, right now, there's a question whether it's going to bounce back or not. Certainly, there has been an upward tick, but since the mid-1990s, in general, violence, murder, including serial killers, have declined in the United States.
Now, when you say there's a question about whether it's bouncing back, are you talking specifically about serial killings, or are you talking about violent crime in general, or both?
I'm talking about violent crime in general.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And I know it goes contrary to, a lot of people think, well, things were a lot safer when I was a kid. No, if you look at statistics, and you're in Canada, we're in the U.S., it's a worldwide, one thing they thought was, well, the U.S. is spending so much money on law enforcement, but that doesn't account for worldwide why violent crime has gone down so much in the past 20 years. I have a few theories about why serial killers are not as predominant as they were. But there are more that's established that serial killings have been on the decline, just like violent crime has. But there are now more shows and documentaries and books and podcasts about serial killers. Why is it that we're still so fascinated with the thing that has been on the decline for 20 years?
If you look at certainly these current shows and books, often they're focused on serial killers from that epidemic era, the 1970s through to the end of the 1990s. So it's a deeply seated need, I think, we have for monster stories, and serial killers are secular monsters. In the past, were werewolves, vampires, ghouls. Serial killers had supplanted them kind of in the 20th century as our monsters. These were, sometimes our neighbors, transformative monsters. Sometimes these were monsters that just arrived on the road, perhaps hitchhiked or drove into our community, but they were definitely monsters, are a sense of modern monstrosity. And so I think this is kind of a human condition, our need for these monsters, but the current crop of serial killers somehow don't have the same kind of imaginative status or celebrity status that the John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy generation of serial killers had. And so most of these shows, including, recently, the one on the Night Stalker on Netflix, are harking back to that era.
So that is Richard Ramirez, who is from the town that our flagship station is in, El Paso, Texas. So you run across people all the time who knew Richard Ramirez, who maybe went to school with him. Why do you think the epidemic years started in the 1950s? What was going on in 1950? Did it have anything to do with just to throw out a wild guess, maybe the interstate highway system, where it was easier to get around the country?
That's one aspect, although one of the aspects of that highway system as well was kind of the dispossession of low-income communities and kind of the fragmentation of those communities, as often those highways were driven through minority neighborhoods, through inner-city low-income neighborhoods, and so you get this kind of massive dislocation of communities which actually creates a victim pool as opposed to necessarily creating serial killers. Certainly the mobility of serial killers is a factor on top of that. I think as well, the 1950s kind of ushers in a post-war period in the United States, and I think we've underestimated the impact that both the Great Depression and the Second World War had on a generation of Americans, both males and females, raising children who will become serial killers. The average age that a serial killer will commit to his first murder is around 28, 27 statistically. But their fantasies, their compulsions, their disorders begin often as early as the age of 5. So when you take a Ted, Bundy, who begins committing his murders in the mid to late 1970s, you got to back him up to when he was a child. And of course, Ted Bundy is born in 1946. Ted Bundy is that first generation of serial killers that are brought up by very assertive mothers who often had to, with either their husband kind of leaving during the Great Depression or leaving for war during the Second World War, you have these assertive mothers that we often see in serial killer biographies. They have to be assertive. They're on their own. And then, of course, you have a generation as well of men who lost their dignity as bread earners in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and then in the 1940s are thrown into combat that was far more intense and traumatic than we ever would acknowledge, even to this day. We understand post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after war in Vietnam, but in the Second World War, we had this very vague notion of shell shock or, neuropsychiatrically impaired soldiers. An astonishing 37% of GIs were discharged and sent home as neuropsychiatric casualties. And so, the lack of a father figure is often a prominent feature in the biographies of the childhoods of serial killers. So now, you have this. Yeah, go ahead.
What it sounds like, and I've heard this before. The rise of violent crime, the rise of serial killers specifically, could be attributed to the breakdown of the family unit. Now, I've heard that a lot of times. As one of the possible causes. Is that kind of across the board something we see in most serial killers, some kind of unstable or broken home?
Yes, the majority of serial killers report that by the age of 14, there's often a total absence of a father figure, either because the father is isolated or is having his own kind of psychological issues, or the father is just simply absent, gone.
Do you consider Charles Manson a serial killer? I see him mentioned as a serial killer a lot of times, but it almost seems like it's a different thing that was going on. It was like he assigned it.
Yeah, Charles Manson, I would say he's a missionary type cult serial killer. He personally never killed anybody, but he inspired people to do so. You have different types of serial killers. Missionary serial killers are... they have a mission in mind. For Charles Manson, it was kind of, helter-skelter, a possible racial war. Right. You have serial killers who target abortion doctors, or you have serial killers who target interracial couples. These are missionary types. So Manson would fit in that missionary type as opposed to our more traditional sexual serial killers, the Ted Bundys, the John Wayne Gacy's.
So one of the theories, we're talking to Peter Vronsky, who is a PhD in criminal justice history and writes about serial killers. one of the main things I've seen put forward as to the decrease is just the way that society's connected because of technology so much. And that has to do with social media. It has to do with even people on the very outer fringes of society, maybe runaways or homeless people, still have a Facebook account and still have a phone. And I think it could also be applied to closed circuit TV. Talk about all of those as causes of the decrease.
Absolutely. The key to any serial homicide investigation is linking a number of victims to a single perpetrator. And, of course, you now have ubiquitously both victims and perpetrators carrying cell phones. Even if, say, the perpetrator is what we call forensically aware and leaves his cell phone at home, the victim, who has no idea what's going to happen to them, is carrying their cell phone and can be tracked. Universal surveillance everywhere now. It's often if someone even thinks of a crime, they're already on video long before they had thought of committing it. And so that certainly is the optimistic interpretation of why there might be less serial killers today. The pessimistic one is that the serial killers just might be better at it. It's a learning process.
I'm sorry, just because of the phone broke up there for a second, the serial killers might just be what, Peter?
That serial killers, the pessimistic version is that serial killers might be better at what they do.
Oh.
Right. They research forensic literature. Serial killers are aware of the risk of carrying a cell phone, the fact that there are video cameras everywhere. So that's the pessimistic interpretation. We think that there are probably roughly 20 to 30 serial killers out there still in the wild.
Is that in the U.S. or worldwide?
In the U.S.
Yeah. We've had 15 minutes. I feel like I wish we had an hour to talk to you about this sort of stuff because there are just so many.
We haven't even gotten to the DNA.
You're right.
But yes,
well,
indeed.
Sure, the DNA. You can find out a lot more than you could 30 years ago for sure, but even 20 years ago. I will say, and I say this as praise for the book, it doesn't veer into sensationalism very often. It almost seems it's almost like a scholarly work. So, but it does keep you turning those pages, though. I'll say that.
Yeah, they're monster stories, essentially. I'm a scholar writing about monsters.
So Peter Vronsky is the author, and his new book about serial killers, American Serial Killers, The Epidemic Years, 1950 to 2000. I think the thing that's going to stick with me is, Peter, as much as you know about serial killers and the history of criminal justice, and that there's a possibility that it might have a pendulum effect and it might swing back at some point. What is the consensus view on that as a possibility?
Well, we really haven't figured out the X factor, but one thing we do know is that the serial killer surges come and they go. They seem, with every surge, to be more intense and, with a larger number of serial killers. If my theory is correct that wartime trauma and economic trauma might be behind the last serial killer surge, then it doesn't look good, considering, 2008, how many families were damaged and broken by that. The war on terror, that by its very nature had to be fought clandestinely, and now not only fought by fathers, but fought by mothers as well. That's a new twist in our society, and so, are these two factors going to affect the generation of children? Plus, the kind of the trauma of COVID. For some, it's more traumatic than others. That kind of isolation. So, are these kinds of social factors going to result in 15 years, 20 years down the road, a new surge of serial killers? We'll see. I
know we're over our time, so we're imposing on your time, Peter, but I had one more thing that I just wanted to kind of pick your mind about. It seems like, and I'm sure somebody has drawn this comparison before, that as serial killers became less preeminent, mass shootings started going up. Could there be something, that people who might have serial killed before do it in the form of a one-time mass shooting?
Yeah, absolutely. Although, often the psychopathology is different. But again, if we talk about what serial killers do as a form of kind of social, cultural scripting, then there is a possibility that some who would have acted out their frustrations, their fantasies on single serial murders might script a mass murder in their fantasy. But I'm not really an expert on mass murder, so I hate to make any kind of deep connection to serial homicide without knowing.
Well, the serial homicide definitely has more of a ritualistic. Would I be right in saying that it's more, especially the ones that kind of dominate, the famous ones, have kind of a ritual aspect to them?
There's a kind of addictive, cyclical aspect to it. Often mass murderers are almost committing a form of suicide. It's a total meltdown destruction of their personality, and there's no coming back from it. Serial killers, on the other hand, want to survive and do come back, and there is this cyclic build-up and then a kind of a release, and then again an addictive build-up, which is not the same dynamic of mass murderers.
If I find myself watching a lot of documentaries and podcasts and reading books about serial killers, do I need to make an appointment with a psychiatrist to see if I'm all right?
Well, my mom did one for me.
Well, the book is American Serial Killers, The Epidemic Years, 1950 to 2000. Peter Vronsky is the author. And thank you, Mr. Vronsky, for taking your time today to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Goodbye.